One of the most legendary friendships in Hollywood history is between Robert Redford and Paul Newman, before the latter's death in 2008. Today, Robert still holds his old friend close to his heart, despite the fact the two only managed to make 2 films together during the several decades they were friends. Join Facts First as we explore the truth about Robert Redford and Paul Newman's relationship. The friendship between legendary actors Redford and Newman began during the production of the 1969 feature film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Paul had already signed on to the film as Butch Cassidy, and the studio was looking for another big star to play the Sundance Kid. Some of the names being kicked around were Marlon Brando and Steve McQueen, but Paul had his heart set on a relatively unknown actor that had tested for the part, Robert Redford. As legend has it, Paul had his heart set on Robert because he liked his acting chops. Paul eventually got his way, and Robert was hired. Robert was incredibly grateful to Paul for getting him the part, and the two began to develop a very amicable relationship on set. In addition to a shared appreciation for each other's craft, the two found they had many other things in common. These included societal values and their sense of humor. After their time filming Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Robert and Paul continued to develop their friendship off-screen. Several years after the release of the film, they reunited for another feature. That was 1973's The Sting, which went on to become an even bigger hit than their prior feature. Despite the fact the pair remained great friends until Paul's death several decades later, they never filmed another movie together. In between filming Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, Robert and Paul became neighbors. Paul already lived in Connecticut, and Robert moved out to the state to join him. The house Robert bought was less than a mile from his friends, which allowed them to spend plenty of time together when the cameras weren't rolling. It was during this period they became incredibly close. Robert has recalled Paul was a much different man than the audience might have expected based on his on-screen persona. While Paul Newman, the actor, was typically finely composed on screen, he was a nervous and chatty person in real life, who was constantly chewing on his fingernails and smoking cigarette after cigarette. According to Robert, Paul could always be found with a cigarette in his mouth and a beer in his hand around this time, though the actor later gave both habits up. Besides their shared values and propensity for acting, Robert and Paul also shared a similar sense of humor. This resulted in the two constantly trying to one-up each other with silly pranks. One of the most notable series of pranks involved both a totaled Porsche and Paul's 50th birthday. The day Paul Newman turned 50, he woke up to a special surprise waiting for him outside on his back porch. Robert had bought him a totaled Porsche and had wrapped it in a bow and delivered it to Paul's house as a joke. Several weeks later, Robert came home from a hard day of work to find there was a strange gift-wrapped box waiting for him in his home. When Robert tried to move it, it was far too heavy. As it turns out, Paul paid to have the joke car compacted, nicely wrapped, and delivered to his close friend's home. Robert had to call in some help to have the present removed, but he eventually got the better of his friend by having the compacted car transformed into an art installation piece in the yard of Paul's mansion. Part of the rules of the prank wars that Robert and Paul routinely engaged in was that neither party could ever bring up the pranks that the other enacted upon them. According to Robert, to speak about the pranks would have tarnished their comedic impact. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Many people have wondered why Robert and Paul never reunited on screen. Considering both the great friendship between the stars and the potential profits such a reunion could have entailed, it seems like it would have been a no-brainer. Things never quite worked out that way, although there had been talks of them reuniting shortly before Paul's death. The film that almost reconnected them was 2015's A Walk in the Woods. It was based upon the 1998 novel of the same name by Bill Bryson, which followed the author on an autobiographical journey through the wilderness as he and his friend attempted to hike the Appalachian Trail. Robert was cast as Bill, and he was attempting to get his friend Paul to portray Bill's friend. For a while, it seemed like Paul was interested, but he turned it down. Robert was devastated when he learned Paul wasn't going to join him in A Walk in the Woods. By that point, they hadn't appeared on screen together in over 3 decades, and both actors were certainly nearing the later stages of their careers. At the end of the day, Robert accepted his friend wasn't up to the challenge, and the film was shelved until another actor was found. It was eventually released in 2015, with Nick Nolte cast in the role Robert had intended for Paul. At the time, Paul had already been dead for several years. He passed away in September 2008 from lung cancer. He was suffering from the illness for several years before passing away, which is partly why he didn't think he was up to the physical challenge that A Walk in the Woods was likely going to demand. Robert visited Paul as much as he could during his final years, though Paul was said to have only let family in towards his final days, because he didn't want even his closest friends to see how much he had deteriorated. When Paul no longer wanted Robert as a physical visitor by his bedside, the two continued to keep in touch through phone calls. Apparently, they were often very hard for Robert, as he could hear his old friend getting worse and worse. At the time of the actor's death, he was 83 years old, over a decade Robert's senior. After Paul lost his battle with lung cancer, Robert was devastated, but he held himself together so he could be there to help Paul's wife and kids. Paul's wife was Joanne Woodward, whom he had been married to since 1958. The actor had 6 adult children, all of whom Robert kept an eye on after Paul's death. Joanne had begun suffering from Alzheimer's disease before Paul's death, which meant Paul was incredibly worried about how she would be taken care of after he passed away. Thankfully, Robert was there to make sure the transition into life without Paul occurred smoothly for the elderly woman. Since Paul's death, Robert has taken every opportunity he can to remind the world of his late friend's impressive legacy. In Robert's eyes, the two are still best friends. According to Robert, his friendship with Paul taught him a great many things he might otherwise never have learned. These include things like humility and compassion. Robert never did forget about how much Paul stuck his neck out for him when he was a relative unknown, passionately testing for the role of the Sundance Kid. Thanks to Paul's perseverance and his love of Robert's craft, the film went on to become one of the most critically acclaimed and beloved westerns in history. Robert continued acting for several years after his friend's death, including A Walk in the Woods. After a 2018 feature called The Old Man and the Gun, Robert decided it was time to call it quits and take it easy for the remainder of his twilight years. Though he has returned to the screen once or twice for an occasional easy cameo, he has effectively made good on his retirement. Now it's time to hear from you. Comment down below to share what your favorite performances were from Robert Redford and Paul Newman. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.